Welcome everyone to our weekly call. As you would have heard, we are now recording. So you should have got a prompt on your respective devices to alert you to that fact. But if not, I've just told you. The main focus of our discussion this week, as you will see if you can see the screen, is going to be around content filtering, and I will hand over to Chris momentarily to lead off on that discussion. If there's time after that, I'll then give or share some thoughts on Apple's soon to be launched a private relay service as well, which is sort of connected to some extent with content filtering, as you'll find out. But if not, that's maybe something we'll pick up on next week. I'll dip into that if time permits. But with that in mind, without further ado, therefore, let me hand over to Chris to sort of lead off the discussion on content filtering. What I suggest, and unless anyone has any really pressing sort of questions, points of clarification as Chris goes through, we maybe sort of step through the presentation first and then have a discussion afterwards. If there's anything you want to raise, then please either use the Zoom tool to raise your virtual hand, or post either a question or your hand raising in the chat, and then at the end of the presentation I'll come to those and we'll go through those in turn. So without further ado, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Again, my name is Chris Abbott. I'm a principal engineer over at Charter Communications. Try to get my mouse back. There we go. So I'm working on an idea for opt-in content filtering. Just to give you a preface of where this came from, we're reacting to ECH, which was discussed a few weeks ago. Our parental control product currently relies on the SNI in order to function, and exploring methods to keep our product going, we thought it would be a good idea to look into an open standard instead of playing the continuous cat and mouse game with trying to keep up with new privacy technologies. The first thing that we had looked at was, what are the use cases? So our particular business unit is going to be focused more on the home, but there's obviously a wider application. So we have in the home, regulated industries, and also enterprise use cases. Among those three institutions, we broke it down into three categories. So we have content control. So that's going to filter based on actual content, whether you're blocking, let's say, social media during homework time for your kids, or if you have a regulated institution and need to filter certain content, or in the enterprise center. And then the other two categories are security and privacy. So whether we're blocking phishing sites, malware sites, or simply blocking asset trackers, etc. Next, we looked at the existing implementations. We broke this down into three categories. So we have our proprietary implementations. So this is typically going to be built into OS and devices, or there's also the case of video streaming. Apps tend to all implement their own form of parental controls. And then we also have DNS-based filtering, and then traffic sniffing, which may involve either header inspection or possibly even deep packet inspection. Before discussing an actual standard for content filtering, we do want to acknowledge pitfalls and controversies. First off, with most content filtering applications, users have no idea what's going on. They don't know that they're leaking any information to some provider gathering this data. Even as the administrator, say a parent in the home, they're not going to have any idea what's going on with the data that's going up to the cloud. And then again, users are not going to be aware that they're on any sort of content filter network. They're not going to have any idea that their traffic's being filtered. And the big piece is they're not able to consent to this filtering. And lastly, deploying content filtering solutions can be rather complex, especially if you have a mixed ecosystem home, or if your particular product relies on some security flaw. It may be, again, a constant cat and mouse game trying to keep up to ensure the filtering continues to work. So why build an open standard? As we've acknowledged, there are certainly use cases out there. So there's most likely going to be products with an open standard. We feel it can give customers a choice of which product they're going to be used with a broader range of implementations. Again, we're trying to get a working group together to actually develop the standard. And we feel with such a working group, we can keep transparency and user consent in mind as a requirement as part of a standard. One goal we'd like to see is applet permissions as to what data is visible upon bootstrapping some sort of filtering service. With an open standard, we feel that the competition for the market will shift towards actually building a good filtering product, and rather who has the best workarounds to collect data in order to perform filtering. And it would also provide a standard for new privacy standards to consider while in development. So our primary goals for such an open standard would be that it's discoverable. The user interface would notify the user of what data is going to be visible to administrators and content filtering service providers. We think it should be consensual. So the user must consent to the filtering product. And just to clarify what happens when the user doesn't consent. Obviously, if a working group got together, it would be something that would be discussed, but in the terms of joining like a content filtered network, if you don't consent, you probably just will not be able to use that internet service. And then privacy, the solution must not leak any information that the user has not consented to leaking, which means that no inherent blocking of DO, ODO, ECH. And again, the solution must be open, so you must be able to swap out different implementations. Some stretch goal is that implementations can be composable. So maybe you have one product that's really great at parental controls, while another that's better at security. The idea is that they could both work together. And then it would also be nice for implementations to work through proxy traffic, like Apple's Open Relay, Odo, etc. The last slide is, in coming up with such a standard, there's different implementation considerations. So I come from an ISP, we have a device in the home, that might not be the case for all product developers. So for the bootstrapping, again, there could be a network appliance in the home or office or business. Certain other parties that own the OS or device stack might have pre-provisioned devices, and then software-only implementations would need to be able to also bootstrap either through logging in through an account or maybe some sort of QR code scanning. And then for applied filtering, there's certainly different levels of features and privacy that need to be considered. So cloud-based implementation would potentially be more feature rich. Maybe you can use the latest AI, be updated on the fly. For those who are more privacy conscious, they might prefer doing the check locally within a space they control, either on their own appliance or a device. And then for the best coverage, we'd also have to consider how to handle legacy devices, whether that's just a simple allow list or block list, using a prescribed DNS server, etc. So it's a brief presentation. I'll open the floor to any questions or thoughts.
Fantastic. Thanks for the quick run through, Chris. That's much appreciated. So as I said earlier, if people could raise their hands using the Zoom tool or use the chat to indicate they want to raise their hand, or if you're in a location where you can't talk but want to ask a question, again, just post the question in the chat and I will sort of read it out. Whilst we're talking, I can see Brett has raised his hand. So Brett, do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Yeah, it's a very simple question, really. I heard you use the word standards a lot, but I didn't hear anything about the IETF. Is this being developed in the IETF or somewhere else?
Yeah, so we're currently trying to work this presentation into an early draft to send out to the Gen Dispatch team.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Although I guess maybe a question for this group, which is particularly au fait with the intricacies of IETF and probably, I think as well, safe to say other standards bodies. Maybe let's pose that question to the group, whether you think putting something to Gen Dispatch for discussion perhaps at IETF 112 is the right route, or you think there's an alternate route either within or outside of the IETF. So any thoughts on that would be, I think, quite useful. But thanks for the question. Brett, Simon. Hi, Simon. You seem to be off mute, but I can't hear you talking. Can anyone else hear Simon talking, or is it just me?
No, I can't hear him.
Okay, let's come back to Simon in a minute and go to Peter.
Again?
Oh, so that worked that time, Simon. Sorry, carry on.
Yes, yeah, the fault of a computer that claims it has a built-in microphone but hasn't actually got a built-in microphone because it's a Mac Mini, so it's never had a built-in microphone. Anyway, beside the point. Yeah, Simon Hicks from Department for Digital. Yeah, welcome this input. It's certainly the sort of thing we like to hear from a governmental perspective, you know, and we love the fact that it's sort of potentially an open standard of it. Obviously, we need to actually see that work in practice, and actually finding the organisation, as I think was intimated there, could be one of the questions. IETF would seem to be the right one, but remains to see how well, of course, it goes there. And certainly, then, you know, great that it could be linked. It could be linked to other standards within IETF or wherever, and be built on from there until actually form part of the sort of as it were, the technical backdrop that everybody can access. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah.
Right, I see Peter, you've also got your hand raised if you want to come in.
Hi, thank you, Chris. That was really interesting. And yeah, I think it's already been said, but I love the idea that this is open rather than just doing a kind of private implementation. I think it's going to be really tricky though, because of trying to combine all the different aspects of different kinds of filtering and the different, not just the different types, but also the different layers. So the DNS filtering and the deep packet inspection and all the other kinds of things. So you had composable as being a stretch goal. And it was that, I guess my question is, any chance of making that not a stretch goal? Because it feels like one of the reasons why there are different layers and they've all kind of succeeded in their own ways is that they're all kind of more applicable to different environments. So I can talk about DNS filtering because that's kind of what I do at the moment. And it's really easy to deploy for a whole network, and it gives you a certain base layer of capabilities. But it doesn't do full URL filtering, obviously, which is really needed for like a full solution. So having the option to implement both layers, I think is important for it to be effective, if that's your goal. So that was my first question about the composability. The second thing was related, the privacy sort of goals that you want to, it's one of the main goals is to make privacy implications obvious and clear and not logging information that's meant to be private. But again, is that going to be sort of configurable somehow, as in for different regions that have different requirements? Also, there's a trade-off between privacy and reporting, which can be really useful. So if you want to see if you're trying to diagnose an issue where an IoT device isn't working properly and you need to know which domains it was accessing, you need to be able to turn off the privacy aspect so that you can log which domains are being accessed on the DNS side. But it will be the same for any kind of filtering, really. You need to identify false positives and false negatives. So you have to kind of willingly do away with privacy for that. Yeah, last question. I know I've got a lot to say. Sorry. Is you talked about the solutions as enforcing some of these things. So does that mean that let's say there is a standard, it's going to be all musts with regards to these things, and or is it going to be a technical measure to enforce these the parts of the standard? Thank you.
Hey,
All right,
so yeah, Chris, so let me start. My name's Wiston. I'm a engineer working with Chris A on this. So like the 3 parts to your question, I think I'm just going to talk about the privacy issue, and then I'll let Chris talk about the enforcement and the first issue raised. So we really don't see this as much about privacy, right? This is really intended for networks where the end user, the network user, and the network operator agree that there should be some restrictions and there should be some filtering going on. Things like schools, things like parental controls,
okay.
Public Wi-Fi, right? We're not trying to solve the adversarial relationship where governments and organizations would just go in and block, privacy enhancements that come along, like China is doing with TLS 1.3 and Russia has kind of done with ECH rolling out. We're not trying to solve that problem. This is targeted specifically at places where everybody agrees there should be some restrictions, and we're trying to make that as transparent so that the end user knows, like, oh, you can't go to these websites, you can't do these things, which is also different than where you have the adversarial relationship where the user doesn't necessarily even know like what they can and can't do, what information is being monitored and what isn't. Does that help?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks. Okay, so it is more about like awareness than like the data that's being monitored.
Yep. Cool. And I'll let Chris A talk about your other 2 points.
Thanks.
yeah, as far as composition, I would definitely like to see that become a primary goal as well. It's certainly something we discuss internally. And then could you repeat the last point?
Yeah, sure. The last thing was about enforcement of okay. You mentioned that the solution should do things. And I was wondering if that's going to be a technical enforcement or like a must in the standard.
It's open to discussion in the working group. We'd be happy just to see the bootstrap portion make it through as a potential RFC at a minimum. And then as far as the actual applied filtering, that's something that would have to be discussed on whether we want to make that a technical requirement or not. Something we've kicked around is something similar to, let's see. Well, we have like Microsoft, Apple, and Google. They all have their own, we call proprietary ecosystem standards. So something we've been kicking around is the idea of maybe making an open version of that, where the browser will learn through the discovery bootstrap process who is performing filtering in this domain space, and then once the browser learns this, it can use some sort of API to determine whether or not a URL or endpoint is accessible. And again, that's an idea that we'd want to discuss in a working group format.
Okay.
Rather more fine-grained than Mozilla's canary domain then, Chris. So rather just on-off. But...
Interesting. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Peter. Vittorio had his hand raised next. If you want to come on, Vittorio.
Yeah, well, thank you for raising this. I think it's it's interesting, and I also think it's long overdue. I've been thinking for quite some time that there is the need to standardize at least some of the aspects around these things, and it would actually be beneficial to, exactly the concerns that are sometimes raised against standardizing this. In terms of transparency and misuse. I think the more standards are there, and the more it's easy to, I mean, make it clear to people what's happening, and do not create exclusionary solutions that only certain operators have and others don't. And I mean, there's a number of reasons that I think you should bring to convince people to standardize this, but it won't be easy. But I look forward to the discussion. One point I think that you will have to think about is that it's not so easy to limit the application of this, any standard you might come up with, to the consensual case. Because even, I mean, in parental control or even corporate filtering on corporate network is really not consensual. I mean, it's consensual in the sense that the owner of the network is giving consent to apply the filtering. But then in terms of the owner of the device that gets filtered, usually the owner of the device doesn't consent. So it's not clear that they actually agree with this. So I think that there will be a lot of conceptual work to do before getting into the technical solutions and the technical layers. So maybe I would start from some kind of high-level conceptual architecture of what this is and what it's for, and then maybe you go down into technicalities once you agree on the concept and on the terminology, because that's also something else that there's not a lot of agreement on terms, even at least in certain cases. But I mean, thanks for doing this. I look forward to participating in this.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you mind if I respond to that? I think that's a really good point. Right, yeah, I think the idea of like what gets filtered on what network, right? Ultimately, that's a political question between the user and the network operator, right? We're not trying to solve that. This is ultimately like about transparency and letting the user know they aren't on a filtered network. Because a lot of times today, right, if you're on a filtered network, you don't necessarily even know what's filtered and what isn't, what's being monitored and what isn't. And like, we want to come out and say, you know, when you're on like public Wi-Fi, for example, you get, you know, a notification like, this is what you can and can't do, you know, on the Wi-Fi at the coffee shop or at the airport or when you're at school, right? And we want you to be aware of that. Whereas today, like, you don't really even know necessarily that that's happening. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve. We're not trying to solve the broader issue around privacy of like what should be inherently encrypted and what shouldn't. Does that help? You know, and we want to do that, right, as part of, you know, as part of this before we get into the technical solution of like how exactly this is going to function and the enforcement mechanism.
And it reminds me of the discussion, I think it was in the DNS Ops working group at the last IETF conference, where Dan Wing presented the DNS error page, sort of structured messaging paper that he and I think Neil Cook and others authored. And again, the whole point about transparency, I think, came up in that discussion. And it does occur to me that there could be some synergies between that paper and this proposal to maybe take some of the ideas in that paper further. I'm just looking, I see Neil is on the call, so may or may not wish to comment on that. In the meantime, though, I see John has raised his hand. So John, do you want to come in?
Sure, thanks. I'm actually thrilled to see this being proposed as at least a startup concept. I think that it's, again, long overdue, but I'm going to make a statement first and then a question second, or maybe two questions. And the statement first is that I think that the components that regulate how the data moves back and forth between the network and the device is very important and is fundamental, but I think that is only about 10% of the problem. That I think that a significant portion of what you're going to end up doing is trying to convince the user interface questions, pushing them deeper up, or pushing that deep data up into the stack so that the user can see it. And I think that this looks more like an industry consortium than it does a standard set. Because you're going to have to get buy-in from essentially all of the components, a variety of different operating system manufacturers and browser manufacturers and app developers who are going to have to agree on implementing the standard to make it visible to the user. And then each of them is going to fight about, well, how exactly do I make it visible to the end user? So that, I guess my statement is that I really want to see this technical component happen, but I think that's going to be a minor part of the overall effort, and the big effort is going to be pushing this up into presentation layer. And how that works is an extremely political question because everyone has their own ideas of user interface. And boy, is that a hot topic. And the question I wanted to pose actually kind of layers into that, in that the title of the topic was opt-in content filtering. And the term opt-in almost implies user control. And so is this standard going to talk about how users can opt in to different sets of content control? And if so, is this a two-way protocol? In other words, are you thinking about the users being able to push into the network their desires for content control, as well as see what the network is applying to them? Because again, user interface, big question there.
Fair point. I think opt-in has two meanings, which I hadn't considered until you mentioned it. There's a consensual content filtering, and then opt-in from the point that you can choose which product you use because it's a open standard.
Yeah.
So I think that's a fair point, that we need to separate those concepts. Our focus is on both, but I think the primary thing is we're more concerned, or mostly concerned, about the consent. But again, we also want it to be open. We certainly don't want to push something through that degrades user privacy or performs filtering without any sort of user consent. If that answers this.
It does answer quite a bit of it. I think you should consider both. The question of who is doing the filtering, or who has control of that filtering, is also an extremely challenging one, because of course the network operator has some ability to filter. The owner of the device has some ability to filter, and then the user of the device has some ability to filter. And where does your proposal, does it address all three of those, or just one of them? I think if you don't address all three, that you may have difficulty getting everyone to agree that the standard should be useful.
No, I would say it addresses all three. So a network administrator can perform some sort of filtering on their entire network, or a parent, all devices within their control, or maybe even an end user, prefers or wants to set up some sort of ad filtering. They might set that up on their device themselves, where they're the user in the network, and the operator in that case. So yeah, our goal would be to touch all cases.
Yeah, and to add a little bit about what you're talking about, the user interface and how this gets presented to the end user. I view this as like, we want to create, a standard with a basic, the base level of information, kind of like, a nutrition label for your network. And then you're right, like how that gets presented to the user will ultimately be up to, the browsers and the apps and that sort of thing. We just want to kind of say, this is the basic amount of information, what that gets presented and what you can and can't do, and how that gets presented, right, we're going to need buy-in from the people that are actually creating the UIs for the end user. Absolutely.
I can see some of the sort of client developers, OS developers on the call, who may or may not wish to sort of chime in with their initial thoughts as well. But in the meantime, Peter, you got your hand raised. So do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, you kind of answered it a little bit, Winston, with the idea about the nutrition labels, which is kind of like what Apple were doing with their app tracked data thing, which is pretty cool, I have to say. My question was going to be, how do you see this? Two questions, actually, sorry. The first thing is, because there are so many different layers that filtering can be implemented, how is it going to work with conflicting, let's say it's happening on both places? The second question is, what do you think this is going to look like? Like, is there any ideas in your head as to how this is actually going to be implemented? Like, could you think of an example implementation, or could you describe one?
Yeah, I think we have some slides on that, right, Chris, in our...
We do.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So for the discovery portion, we were focusing on DNS-SD. Again, we wanted to discuss this in a working group, but we wanted to have some ideas up front. So we're not prescribing any sort of technical implementation at this point. But for discovery DNS SD, this might include enough parameters to bootstrap some sort of content filtering service. And then for applied filtering, these are specific to having a network gateway in the home. Again, if we go back to this slide, it's not going to cover everybody's use case. But for applied filtering, we looked at maybe a mechanism for enforced DNS. So if you might do your filtering at the DNS level, but obviously there's situations where a user can simply bypass that DNS filtering. IP reputation scoring, we also looked at man in the middle, which is very specific to ECH, where you inject your own public key to decrypt the TLS header to get the SNI info. And then, as I mentioned before, an out-of-band type solution that mimics what we're seeing the major OS vendors do, only an open protocol for doing that. For DNS SD, again, it would just transmit the minimal parameters to bootstrap the service. We'd want whoever's doing the filtering to be cryptographically verifiable. So, we don't want anybody, in my case, mimicking that they're charter.com doing the filtering. And then just the last point, the specifics to DNSD is not that important. We like it in our internal group, but the main aspect is that, again, this is network specific, that you can discover you're on a filtered network and allow that bootstrapping and notification to occur. As far as enforced DNS, we ruled it out on the case that specific to ECH, where if the CDN provides a HTTPS record, it's possible to potentially bypass that, which is the last section below. IP reputation is something we're pretty against, but we did explore it. It wouldn't work for CDNs. It definitely doesn't require any sort of discovery and can be implemented covertly. Malicious endpoints can simply just change their IP address to potentially bypass. And then if you've done anything with email filtering, you'll know, a new email server inheriting a bad reputation can be a headache for technical support. Man in the middle approach, again, ECH specific. This just it's a level of enforced DNS as well. You'd have to use the network operator's HTTPS record to use their public key so they can decrypt the encrypted hello packet. If the network provider is unable to decrypt it, they're not using your DNS service. So that kind of enforces DNS as well. This would both allow either DNS filtering or SNI based filtering. And then the out-of-band approach. Again, this is to mimic, if you go to watch a movie on Netflix, it's going to reach out to Netflix's server, or if you're using a Microsoft browser, it's going to reach out to Microsoft's family product to see if that URL is allowed. So it's just an open version of that. We felt this might be the most future-proof. It's going to be in-band network protocol agnostic. Since it's open, it would be a mixed ecosystem, and it could be used to filter more than just hosting. So we could potentially open it up to ratings on content as well. Downside, as was pointed out, it would require major buy-in, which may be difficult and challenging. It would have to be implemented in each OS and major app. A malicious app could potentially obfuscate where it's trying to browse out to bypass filtering, and it definitely has a poor fallback. So we'd have to look at other solutions if you want wide coverage. And this is just a very basic example of how it would work. Again, with a network-based implementation, a device would potentially use DNSSD, which gateway would respond to with, where's this cloud service that would do your content filtering. on the customer device, they try and access some content, it checks with the cloud if that's allowed or not, and then the device would either block or allow the content. And I just want to reiterate, we're not trying to prescribe any sort of technical solution. We did do some exploration on our own, very focused on a network-based filtering implementation. We certainly understand and want to include the other situations as far as OS and device vendors, or maybe just an implementation that uses an app to do the bootstrapping and they have no hardware in the home or business.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Plenty of food for thought there. It's worth highlighting purely because somebody reached out to me shortly before the call, Jason Livingood from Comcast, that there have been previous attempts to do something in this space. He referenced one that he was involved with back in, I think it was 2009, which doesn't mean to say it can't be done, but simply it certainly has surfaced in the past in the IETF. So it'd be interesting at some point to look back on that discussion to see what the blockers were in that moving forward, to see if those barriers can now be overcome. Now I'm conscious quite a few people have commented with broadly, I'd say, supportive comments. I'd be interested to know, does anyone think this is a bad idea for any reason that would like to just come in with their thoughts?
I think this is Neil.
I know.
Right. I think that if you're thinking of IETF, I think that this will struggle in the IETF. Anything to do with content filtering in the IETF is pretty difficult and contentious to get through. I think about how difficult the ad group was to get going. Just times that by a factor of 20. Just to mention the words content filtering in the IETF and just dive for cover, basically. So yeah, I'm going to say that. I would also have a couple of other comments about the stuff around discovery. And I wasn't quite sure what was really meant by that, because it was talking about covert. If something's covert, then it's not going to show itself for a discovery protocol. And if something isn't covert, then we already have the existing protocols, the extended error codes, and indeed the stuff, as Andrew mentioned earlier, that myself and Dan and others are working on with regard to structured error information. So how does that help? Because surely those things all tell you when you're being filtered. Okay, this tells you before you get a filtering result, but I just don't understand how that's helping with covert, at least, because if something's covert by its very nature, it's not going to respond to that.
So I'm going to think of the DNS filtering product. So if you own the network, and again, this is network specifics, and you offer up your DHCP with your DNS servers that perform filtering, the user is not going to inherently know. I mean, worst case, they're just going to try and visit something, it's not going to work, and they're not going to have any idea why. With our idea for discovery
But that's what the extended error codes tell you. And indeed the structured error information that Andrew referred to. That's what those existing drafts and standards already do.
Fair enough. So just think of an SNI based filtering where we're just going to not allow a TLS connection to go. As far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no way to provide an error page for SNI based filtering that's not necessarily web based.
Yeah, non-DNS based, I agree with that. Yeah.
So part of the discovery bootstrapping phase, let's talk ECH specific because it blocks SNI. It would provide possibly in that in a DNSSD message, it could include where to get our public key to encrypt so that the content can be filtered. Obviously, if both devices implement this, they could potentially do a covert leave, whereas we would want that to be brought up to the user that that's happening. So rather than just implement some sort of discovery protocol where the user is not notified, does all the handshaking behind the scenes to enable that filtering to happen, we feel it would be a requirement that the user be notified this is occurring. And that's something like your host names are going to be visible to such and such provider that's performing the filtering. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Ben, I can see you've raised your hand. Do you want to come in?
Sure. So can I make a few observations that I offer to help maybe steer this effort to more success? Because I think it's a good effort and I'd like to see it succeed. Let's not call it content filtering. In fact, let's not refer to content filtering, because in reality, content itself is not being examined or studied or filtered itself. There's no content actions really being discussed here. Instead, what we're really talking about is connection management, right? What connections will be allowed, what connections won't be allowed. And if we focus on that, I think maybe this has a higher chance of getting through some discussion, because there's applications to a wide range of things. And I think when we use the term content filtering, it sends people down a very particular, narrow, and very hostile set of paths to thinking about what is going on. Whereas if we manage connections, that's actually a pretty useful thing. So for instance, let me give a couple examples. I have a bunch of IoT devices in my home. I would like to be able to manage the connections that they are able to connect to, because they don't need to connect to the entire world. And I would like the ability for my network to signal to that infrastructure and to the rest of the world what they should and should not do. That's actually a pretty good thing. Certainly there are applications where I want to control where children can go. I don't want children going to gambling sites. I don't want children going to known things that are known malware. And I think we're all in agreement here. But at the end, it's not that these services we're building are going to monitor the content and make decisions around it. They're going to manage our connection. So if we focus on calling it that, I think maybe we can actually get a lot more allies behind this idea than if we go forward with its content filtering, because that's going to be a non-starter in so many places.
I would agree.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. We really don't like the content filtering name, so that's actually really helpful.
Yeah. So and let's have some conversations ongoing, because I think I offer my help to work through some of these discussions, because I have some experience in the ITF, as I know you do, and maybe we can work together to like sort of examine the edge cases here and make it a more palatable proposition.
It'd be appreciated. Thank you,
Glenn. Just whilst you're on screen, as it were, what putting you on the spot process-wise, any immediate thoughts about the idea of putting something to Gen Dispatch, maybe with a view to trying to get a BOF at next but one IETF?
Couple thoughts. Typically, fall ITFs are terrible ones to pitch brand new ideas out at. Just historically, I've noticed that the new ideas pitch better in the March timeframe, and then you sort of push to get some decisions made in the summer timeframe and the group created potentially. So I think don't pitch it in the fall ITF is one advice I would give. The other thing I would say is get a draft. I think it's more important to get a draft with some solid ideas on requirements that then can go to a next phase of a draft around, well, how would you propose doing it, and have those two things be companions, because often people present a solution without the requirements, and sometimes people present the requirements without a solution. If you bring two of them together, they're actually pretty powerful, because you can say, here's a problem statement and here's an approach to doing it. And a lot of people will, argue and want to refine the problem statement. That's fine. That means you got ideas being put in there. You got people that might be collaborators. And likewise, people will hate the technical solution proposal. They'll find a bunch of problems with it. But that's good too, because now you have a bunch of other people who are interested enough in complaining about the problem that you can ask them, well, how can you fix it? And those are potential collaborators, and that's how you build consensus big enough to go forward a working group. So that's my advice there. And the other question is Gen Dispatch the right place? I don't know if Gen Dispatch is the right place. It's a place to consider, but there's always the question of does Gen Dispatch have the right people in the room to help you put this over the over the goal, or does it just have people in the room that will have opinions about it, but really won't help move it along? So, for what it's worth.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. I can't see any hands raised. I'll just give a prompt for anyone else that wants to come in with any questions, comments, offers for help, or anything else that hasn't spoken yet. A reminder, as I said, if you're not in a position where you can talk but want to put something in the chat, that's also fine. I'll just give you a minute or two to do either. Looks like possibly not at the moment, so perhaps we've exhausted people's immediate comments, which is really helpful. Well, Chris and colleagues, and hopefully that's given some good food for thought to at least sort of start this journey. And I suspect it will be a journey, and probably not a short one, but you probably knew that, because if it was easy, someone would have done it already. But at least I've heard so far quite a few people agreeing that it's a good thing to at least try and come up with a solution for, which is encouraging. So I suspect this is a topic we might come back to a few times in the coming months, given it is pretty important. So hopefully that was useful, and hopefully this is very much going to be the start of a discussion that we can continue. So anyone that hasn't spoken, that perhaps has some thoughts afterwards, maybe there'll be an opportunity to reach out to the team at Charter as well with any offline thoughts you may have. To start to sort of build this coalition of the willing, which feels like a good phrase for a Monday afternoon. Okay, well, thank you for that. I hope that was useful, everyone. Changing subject, then I sort of suggested at the start that if time permitted, we would move on to talk about private relay, specifically some of the sort of implications behind private relay, just building on a roundtable discussion which I had the pleasure to host a few weeks ago. But realistically, I don't think that's a topic it would be wise to try and cover in roughly 5 minutes. I think that'll be, I don't mind being ambitious, but that might be a bit too ambitious. So what I'm going to post in the chat, if you've not seen it already, is a link to notes that I took at the round table, so you can get an idea some of the ground that was covered. I should say, and you'll see this in the notes, it was covered under the Chatham House rule. So although the notes, you'll have to take my word for it, comprehensively cover what was said, they hopefully will give you no indication as to who may have said them, either individuals or organizations. But we'll maybe come back to that discussion this time next week, just to be quite topical, because all things being equal, I believe that iOS 15 and its stablemates will be launched tomorrow. And iCloud Plus from that point on will have at least some support for private relay. So it will definitely be a topical discussion to pick up on next week. So the discussion that we'll have then will focus very much on the implications for network operators and ISPs in particular. So those of you in that space may find it interesting to click on the URL I sent, have a look at the paper in advance, and then I'll sort of take you through some of the key findings this time next week. Right, so that brings us very much on to any other business in the last 4 minutes or so. Does anyone have anything else that you would like to raise on the call this week? And if you do, please either put it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. I'll give you a chance to do that. Not seeing any hands raised at the moment, nor anything in the chat. So that being the case, let's in that case close the call there. So we get 2 minutes back. So thank you everyone for your time and attention this week. Thanks in particular to Chris and colleagues at Charter for sort of providing a thought-provoking presentation. And have a fantastic week, everyone. And we'll speak same time next week. Thanks all.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks,
Thank you
all.
very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.